Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Diplomats webinar series. Today, we are going to be talking about the economic implications of the Russia-Ukraine war and the sanctions that have followed for the Asia-Pacific region. Russia may not have intended for its invasion of Ukraine in late February to have global economic consequences, but that's where we are today. In addition to shortages in sectors where Ukraine has been a major supplier, including wheat and sunflower oil, among others, Russia's economy has been largely cut off from the G7 through sanction efforts. And those sanctions are seriously impacting the ability of even willing partners to continue trade with Russia. We've often talked about decoupling in the context of China-US economic relations here at the Diplomat, but now Russia's ouster from the SWIFT network has driven home exactly what decoupling can look like in its most extreme form, and that is reverberating across the Asia-Pacific region. So in this webinar, we want to focus on how Asian economies are weathering the geoeconomic storm being caused by the war, from the short-term shortages to longer-term questions about globalization versus economic self-reliance. And I'm very pleased to welcome three experts today who are going to help us sort through these issues. We are joined by Dingding Cheng, who is a professor of international relations at Jinan University in Guangzhou, China, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, Germany. He's also the founding director of Intellicia Institute, an independent think tank in China, as well as a frequent contributor to the Diplomat. So welcome, Dingding, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Also joining us today is Dr. Biswajit Dar, who's a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning School of Social Sciences at JNU in New Delhi, India. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Dar.
Yeah.
And finally, we have Bruno Massais, who is the director at Diplomat Risk Intelligence, the research and consulting division of the Diplomat. He's also the author of numerous books, most recently Geopolitics for the End Time, which I think is a disturbingly apt title in the context of 2022. So Bruno, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, Shannon.
I'd like to start with you, Bruno, just to ask you to give a brief overview, if such a thing is possible, of the economic consequences that the Russia-Ukraine war is having on Asia-Pacific trade.
Well, good morning or good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I know it's been watched in different places. Well, for us in Europe, obviously, there's a certain tendency to think that this conflict is at the center of everything. And in a way, it isn't. And we've heard voices from the Indo-Pacific arguing that in the end, there are more important issues happening in the region. They were more decisive for the future of the Indo-Pacific than this conflict. I've been trying in my writings and my op-eds and my essays to try to convince people that in fact this is a conflict of global consequences and global impact. One reason for that has to do with geopolitics and security, the other more economic. And very briefly, the first one, we have here a conflict, in fact, between global superpowers. That's the difference between this and other conflicts we had in Europe, particularly in ex-Yugoslavia, that in this case, you have an indirect clash between the West as a whole, working as a bloc, and Russia. And it's very difficult in this case. A lot of the anxiety that we're feeling and the concern, particularly in Europe, is that very difficult in this case to think of a mediator above the parts, above the conflicting parts. You know, some people would suggest China could play that role. I don't think it can or is even interested in playing that role. And so it is a conflict without a safety valve because there's no one above the conflicting parties that can provide security, order, and some kind of resolution. I think that's an important issue, but we'll a bit more focus on the economic impact. And that I think we're starting to see the ramifications. The crisis in Sri Lanka has many causes, but one of them, certainly the most immediate one, is the precipitous rise in food and fuel prices, which is creating problems for many countries, particularly those that already find themselves in a vulnerable position through economic mismanagement or through a rise in the levels of public debt. That has happened anyway over the past decade because the geopolitical circumstances were seen as very different, seen as favorable. There was a drive for infrastructure building, and some countries find themselves now in a vulnerable position. What we've seen, as you said, is what decoupling really looks like, and the impact of that is being felt immediately. We still don't know how fast this will happen, but we know there will be a decoupling in the energy sector between Russia and Europe. Significant development because energy was in fact the link between Russia and Europe. You could say energy links were the factor keeping Russia within the European sphere, within the European orbit. Russia was fundamentally a European country because it was part of the European economic system as the main energy provider. And that also was the backbone for many other connections, business connections, even people-to-people contacts. They were very dependent on the energy links, and they are now being ruptured. What will be the consequences? Well, in one way, one could imagine that a lot of the energy reserves, both oil and natural gas that Russia has, might end up being stranded and having difficulty finding markets. And the consequence of that would be a significant and permanent rise in energy prices, not just temporary. Why would that happen? Well, there could be an oil and in the future gas embargo applied against Russia. Would other countries be able to step in, and we'd essentially see a reshuffling of energy sources, that Russian oil and gas would go to the Indo-Pacific and oil and gas from the Gulf would stop going to China, would now go to Europe? That would increase prices marginally, but it wouldn't be a dramatic or permanent change. But obviously what could happen, and I suspect would happen in some ways, is that there will be limits on how much Russian oil and gas can be acquired by other players. We've already heard a lot of talk about how the United States in particular has communicated to other potential buyers, India, Pakistan, that some rise in energy imports from Russia will be accepted, but something dramatic might trigger indirect sanctions of some kind. Those indirect sanctions might be applied to insurance, might be applied to shipping. All this would make it difficult for countries in the Indo-Pacific to import Russian energy. They might not even be applied by public authorities. It might just be the case that an insurance company would decide not to insure the transport of oil from Russia to India or to Pakistan because it would be seen as too risky, or it would be seen as even a reputational risk of some kind. So I think countries in the Indo-Pacific have to be aware of this. Consequences would be rather dramatic for energy prices. Therefore, we could expect a series of economic crises with potential political consequences also across the Indo-Pacific. And the second factor, very briefly, is of course food prices. We know that in developing countries and in emerging economies, there's a direct relation between food prices and political unrest or political stability. And the war is bound to continue. The blockade on Ukrainian ports is bound to continue. The news we get from Ukraine is that there's agriculture, farming has been stopped in most of the country. There's no access to manpower, to workers. There's no access to fuel. Everything is focused on the war effort. And on top of the blockade of the ports, there's really very little activity going on, and that's what should be expected. Also, Russia is finding it more difficult to export its agricultural production. Can India step in? I guess that will be a question for our discussion later on, but it just so happens that the climate is not helping, and India is also suffering some difficulties in increasing its agricultural production this year. But on these two very sensitive topics with the immediate political impact, the implications of the war are genuinely global in my view, and not regional. And that's why this war should also be a deep concern for public authorities all over the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Bruno. As we've mentioned, this war is really driving home the ways that the global economy is connected and the ways that it can potentially be disconnected if parties feel strongly enough about the cause. Ding Ding, you've written about this a bit already for The Diplomat, but I hope you can talk to us about the implications for China, which is in something of a unique position, a very close partnership with Russia, including economically, but also a very globalized economy, which has led to some wariness about directly flouting sanctions, even though China disagrees with them quite strongly in principle.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, and thanks for organizing this very important and timely discussion. And I would agree with some of the points that have just been raised by Bruno just earlier, that this is a global event, geopolitical event, a tragedy, if you will, that would have a very strong impact not only on European affairs, but also certainly on Asia Pacific and including China, of course. And because of limited time, I just wanted to focus on what kind of a potential impact it could have on China's economy and China's economic relationships with its major partners like the US and Japan and to some degree India. I would like to make 3 points. Number one point is that China is in a very uncomfortable position as it is now. This is mainly for 2 reasons. Number one, again, the war did not really suit China's interests in a fundamental way. I understand that there are a lot of opinions out there, particularly maybe in the US and Europe, that would think China encouraged Russia or at least supported Russia to attack Ukraine. But I think this is actually a misunderstanding, because unstable world, unstable regional environment would be very bad for China's economic and social developments. And for that reason, and I think for that reason alone, China would not, from the very beginning, support this war. But as everybody is aware of, China's close partnership with Russia. So now the war has already started. What can China do, right? So it's not something that China would prefer to be in this position. And because of that, and partly because of that, China is facing the potential actually economic sanctions from the US and then the other Western allies. If, for example, China provided the material military support to Russian military or supported Russia's financial institutions to evade some of the sanctions imposed by US and the European countries on Russia, and so on and so forth. So China has that, I think, the potential price to pay for a war that yes, China didn't start and China didn't want to see that happening. But anyway, we are in this position. So that's the number one real serious risk, economic risk facing China. And on top of that, we, for the last 3 years, we have had COVID, we have had geopolitical tech competition between the US and China, and now we have the war. So this is like the third sort of a black swan, right? In the last several years that we couldn't predict 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So now we are in this triple dilemmas, if you will, a situation for China. And number two, in addition to the potential sanctions by the US and the Western allies, Russia's economy also itself poses a risk for Chinese economy. And Russia's economy, as we all know, is not a very big economy. It's not even the top 10 or even barely the top 20 economies in the world. So, for example, my home province, Guangdong province, of course, being the largest provincial economy in China, its economic size is actually larger than Russia's economic size right now. So, economically speaking, Russia actually cannot contribute too much, to China's economic development. If you look at, export numbers, import numbers, and technology collaboration, technology transfer, so on and so forth. So Russia does, of course, provide a very crucial source of economic support for China. That's energy, right? As everybody knows very well. So Russia's energy support or potential support to China will be very crucial if, and again, this is a if, if China's economic relations with the US and other European countries actually fall down to a very, very serious level. So Russia's energy supply would give China a secure supply of energy over the long term. But right now, that's not the biggest source of energy stability for China's economic development. So in that sense, Russia's economy cannot contribute to China's economic development very much at the moment, at least, and not even for the next 5 or 10 years. So in this sense, Russia, economically speaking, is not really contributing to China's potential economic development. And also, Russia is not a technology power. And China has to support Russia in terms of technological developments if in the future Russia would face further all sorts of pressures and sanctions from the US and other Western allies. So people here in China wonder, what's the benefit of supporting Russia, right, economically, right? So we understand from a strategic point of view, it's very important to be supportive to Russia, because everybody now understands, at least from the strategic circles point of view, that U.S. would come, to kind of crush China if Russia is, finally defeated by the U.S. and its allies. So now it's a good time to support Russia from a strategic point of view. But economically, it's not. Economically, it's actually a negative to be linked so close to Russia. Russia economy doesn't contribute to China's economic development. It's a liability. It's not an asset, at least in the near to medium future. In the long term, we don't know. We have to see. And also China's businesses, as has been reported by some news media, kind of reluctant to conduct business with Russian counterparts, partly because of including financial institutions, including trade businesses, and also some society to society level exchanges. So I think this is not, I would say, short-term phenomenon. It actually has its structural reasons, and it will continue to be like this in the next 5 to 10 years. And of course, it's not only US and Russia and China, it's also Japan. And Japan, for this reason, Japan's relationship with Russia is also deteriorating. Maybe again, it's a result of multiple factors. And because of China's close relationship with Russia, Japan might distance itself from the Chinese market. And India, to some degree, is playing its card very well. India now is the most popular player in the world. In a way, being quoted by all major powers. The US wants India, Russia certainly wants India, and China certainly wants India to be a neutral player in all of this. So India is playing its cards very well by maintaining a good relationship with US, but also with Russia, and also to some degree, to lesser degree, a stable relationship with China. So China's position, I think, economic position at least is, to summarize, is suffering from this Russian-Ukraine war. And of course, the bigger risks are still down the road when US companies or Western companies, because of COVID, because of China's domestic economic policies, gradually wanted to shift their productions to countries like India and Vietnam and other countries. So I think this is the great decoupling we've been worried about. And China is not economically strong enough to withstand such kind of economic decoupling. So I think for the next 3 to 5 years, it's actually very, very critical for China to maintain effective and workable economic relationship with the US and its European partners, while maintaining a strategic relationship with Russia. Of course, this is a very difficult balance to maintain, but that's the way China, I think, has to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ding Ding, for that wonderful overview of the many different considerations for China. Particularly appreciated your distinction between the strategic level, which is what we so often hear about, the no limits partnership, versus the economic level, because as you noted, the two are quite different in terms of their calculations on China's end. So Biswajit, Ding Ding mentioned India has been playing its cards very well. I would love to hear more from you on that, in the economic sense in particular. What impact is India already experiencing, and how is the government responding? And do you think this is going to accelerate or shift India's trade strategy that was already in place before the war?
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you for having me in this very interesting discussion. Let me preface my comments on the economic implications by saying that when the war started and the UN General Assembly resolutions came, and India was seen to be, not taking any sides, I think there was a lot of surprise in many parts of the world, because for the past more than a decade and a half, I would say, India had actually developed a strategic relationship with the United States. And, there is a saying in many parts of India that you can't have two swords together at one place. So a shift towards the US actually meant that, there would be a certain amount of cooling off with the relationship with the Russians, and we have had a very long historical relationship with the Soviet Union. And during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was one of the closest allies of India. And in many ways, the Soviets came ahead and supported India on the Kashmir issue and many others. So there was this whole historical relationship, but that seemed to be getting quite as India was increasingly getting into the US kind of alliances. Again, further down, we became a part of the Quad and had strategic partnership with the US on various fronts. So India taking sort of becoming kind of a fence sitter in this this conflict certainly raised a lot of eyebrows. So I did some sort of research and started looking at what could be the potential reasons, because as far as trade relations is concerned, India-Russia trade relation is not really as robust as with other countries. I was just looking at the statistics. Russia is India's 24th largest trade partner. So it's way down the list in terms of the commercial relations. We import some oil, but that's only about 2% of the total oil, crude oil we import. So our dependence on Middle East is much larger. We've been importing a lot of oil from the United States as well. So even on the oil front, things have been very different. We do import some fertilizers and certain other energy sources like coal. So when you look at the trade relations, you don't see the reason why India should be backing Russia in this kind of a manner. So the answer lies elsewhere. Answer lies in the kind of the military supplies that India has been getting from Russia. And what also surprised me was that I've been following this, but I really got surprised when I saw that since the present government came into power in 2014, there have been 19 deals struck with the Russians on armaments, and many of these deals involve production through joint ventures in India. Now, you know that this government is talking a lot about self-reliance. They have a whole big strategy on self-reliance, which was unveiled in 2020. And so I thought, this whole thing was fitting very well into the kind of a narrative that the government had developed, had put in place. And of course, the arms dependence, and I just looked at some of the numbers that in the last 20 years, we received armaments worth about $39 billion from the Russians. And as compared to that, from the US, the arms imports were less than $5 billion. So clearly, there was a very solid, reason why India-Russia partnership had actually assumed importance for the government of India. And currently it has become even more. So, the kind of border tensions we have been having with China. India finds itself in a very tricky situation in South Asia with Pakistan on one side and China on the other. And therefore, it will be very difficult for India to really decouple from Russia, if that is the term that we're using today. And any sort of hint at decoupling would actually risk India's own preparedness in this very politically volatile region. So my hypothesis is that what really drove India towards Russia, or at least not taking a stand against Russia, let me put it this way, was the fact that we are militarily dependent on Russia, and as I said, that all these additional incentive of producing armaments at home, all this sort of made a nice little package for the government to take the position it did. So having done this, now the things have actually started shifting quite considerably on the commercial side as well. Because now, Bruno mentioned about possibilities of other countries, including India, dipping into these the oil and gas surpluses that Russia is now developing, and India is very much there in the pipeline, in the business, and not just in the pipeline, in the business. So I was just looking at some of the numbers on crude oil imports, and this is from February, when the war began, till May, last week. And our imports of crude oil, as compared to the corresponding period last year, had increased by almost 400%, hugely. Petroleum products by about 175%, fertilizer imports by about 775%. So these are very big numbers in terms of our increasing imports from Russia. And each of these areas are extremely critical for India at this stage. For instance, and this is something that our finance minister has gone on record and said that if she's getting oil cheap, why shouldn't she buy in the country's interest? And the reason is that India, like many other countries, is currently going through a phase of high inflation. In fact, it has been, again, historically, the last few decades, we haven't seen this kind of rise in wholesale price index. And again, coming at the back of the pandemic-induced downturn, and the kind of problems that we faced on the job market. The job market is still, labor market is still significantly in a problem. So high inflation means that the poor actually get hit very badly. And this is something that the government cannot actually tolerate, because India has a very interesting electoral system that on the face of it, we have to make the general elections every 5 years, but you have significant elections in the state governments almost every year, and several state governments go to the poll every year. So we are consistently in an electoral cycle. So the government can't really act in a manner to say that, look, 2024, when the general elections are due, it's still 2 years down the line, and we can do whatever, and maybe we can address the public sentiments then. We really can't do it now. So high inflation, disruption in the labor market, and it's all adding up to a very difficult situation. On top of that, agricultural production, and Bruno mentioned this, that agricultural production in India, and especially the second largest commodity, wheat, actually dipped somewhat. And if you have fertilizer shortages that we had a few months back, then it's going to be disrupting agriculture even more. So here we are in a situation that sort of closeness with Russia has become a necessity, and this is how the government actually looks at it. And this is what the finance minister has been talking about, that she needs to do whatever she can for people. So finally, I would just want to address this issue of how India might play a role in the dislocation of agricultural trade, especially wheat trade. India, the government had started exporting a lot of wheat since last year. And this year, we were actually planning much more than what we did last year. So all these were planned. But what is actually what is happening currently is that the food stocks are running pretty low. And if the government keeps exporting and the food stocks aren't available for, we have a food security program, food distribution system, public distribution system the government runs. So if the food stocks run low, then that's going to be a huge problem. So again, in terms of India filling in that gap that is left by Ukraine's inability to export, or even Russia's the disruption that Russia is facing, that seems limited at this point in time. So so I think clear that India is going to get far from getting decoupled. India is getting more coupled with Russia. How far the West is going to tolerate that? Bruno talked about the US saying that they will tolerate it up to a point. I think that was a message that we got from the State Department officials also last month. But in the face of these numbers, we'll have to see where the next game plays itself out. So this is what I had to say in my initial comments, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of food for thought there from all of your presentations. That's a great overview of what's been going on at the regional level as well as individual countries. We've mostly talked about the government level thus far. I'd like to take a moment to put ourselves in the shoes of individual companies who are trying to make these decisions for themselves. So a firm in China, India, or elsewhere in the region, maybe Japan or Indonesia, Vietnam, are they seeing this as an opportunity? There's obviously quite a lot of space in the Russian market right now for if you're a Chinese technology company in particular, based on the withdrawals of Western firms. Or is this too risky? Are companies not willing to run the gauntlet of sanctions and the huge risk that comes with potentially being put on that sanctions list themselves? So again, Bruno, maybe you can start us out with kind of a regional perspective, and then Ding and Biswajit, I'd love to hear more from you as well.
Two very quick thoughts. Well, first of all, we've been seeing a lot of this phenomenon of self-sanctioning. I talk to companies a lot, and that's been quite remarkable. That means that companies don't wait for decisions from public authorities. They make their own judgments, sometimes quasi-geopolitical judgments. They decide what is acceptable in terms of their risk management and what is not acceptable. And in many cases, they are well ahead of public authorities in deciding, for example, to leave the Russian market. Many companies were already doing this back in January. And then, of course, in February, it was a tsunami of companies leaving Russia and leaving Russia with no intention of going back. Some of them had actually room to navigate the sanctions. The sanctions have been limited. This is not the sanctions plan against Iran. They had room to navigate, but they thought it was too risky, that sooner or later they would get in trouble. And there's also huge reputational risks. You saw that some companies that insisted on doing business in Russia became the targets of social media attacks, which has now become a huge factor. Not just directly for companies, but also for management, for CEOs that don't want to be accused of being of condoning human rights abuses or a very destructive war. And the stories of war crimes filling the newspapers don't help companies that continue to do business with Russia. This is obviously something that will have a huge impact. In a way, authorities are no longer fully in charge of what happens. Companies are making a lot of these judgments, and particularly large multinationals, large tech multinationals are making these judgments on their own. Then the second comment is, well, how would China, India, other countries navigate this? I'm very interested to hear Ding Ding on this in particular, because he does so much work on the tech sector. But I suspect it will be very tempting for China to try to do both things at once. On the one hand, limit the risks, and therefore its flagship companies, global leaders will probably not get too involved with Russia, or not involved at all. And we've seen that, contrary to some expectations, Huawei is trying to stay away from Russia and perhaps even to leave some business activities that it was planning. But on the other hand, there are huge opportunities in Russia, because Western sanctions and Western decoupling leaves open a huge field of opportunities for Chinese companies and perhaps for Indian companies in the tech sector, fintech, and so on. So how do you deal with this? I suspect, and be interested in what Vishwashti and Ding Ding have to say about it, but I suspect you could come out with a strategy where some of your leading companies will not get involved in Russia, but some of the smaller companies, those that, by the way, don't operate in the West and so are not as vulnerable, or those that can operate under the radar, those will move into Russia and will develop a significant presence there. And there's a lot of opportunities to both to make money, but to increase your economic influence in Russia. I suspect that even though Ding Ding thinks this is bad news for China, certainly is in the short, medium term, but over the long term, there's a huge opportunity here for Chinese companies to become completely dominant in the Russian market. And why wouldn't that be a good thing for China?
Yep, Ding Ding, well, I'll let you chime in as well, and maybe you can answer Bruno's question.
Yeah, I think to answer Bruno's question, I think it would depend on three factors at least, right? Number one, how attractive is the Russian market really, right? How big is the Russian market, right? We talked about Russia's economy not being one of the top 20 economies in the world, and it's declining because of internal difficulties, structural, and because, again, the war, the sanctions. So if you are a business person or head of a company, you look at the Russian market, first of all, it's not that big, right? It's smaller than our Guangdong province market. It's smaller than South Korea's market. And the long-term prospects are even worse, right? It's going to get smaller and smaller. So what's the incentive for you to get into that market? Even from a strict economic point of view, right? It's a declining market. It's not, population is not, growing too much. And there are very limited, space for foreign companies, especially Chinese ones. And Russia has always been a part of a European kind of identity, of course, debatable. So I think that's number one. And then number two, even if you get into the Russian market, what you can potentially gain or profit, is it going to be bigger than the kind of risks you're going to get from Western sanctions, pressures, and all that, right? That's another big question I think every company will have to try to make clear or try to answer. I don't know, of course, but my tendency is that it's probably not going to be much bigger than the kind of risk you're going to encounter in the future. So in the short term, there's a vacuum, the market is maybe open, but in the long run, does it really help your business? I'm not so quite sure. And the third one is the Russian economy itself. Russian economy is mostly a self kind of a reliant economy, but it has abundant energy resources, it has abundant other kinds of resources. What it lacks actually that you can get from China is a kind of I want to say high tech, but it's not really the top high tech, right? The companies like Apple, like Microsoft, they are still the world, top level companies that Chinese companies are no match at the moment, at least. Maybe 10 years, 20 years later, you're going to see, emerging companies like Huawei and others. But at the moment, I think Chinese tech companies, particularly, are not able to meet the vacuum left by Western companies in terms of semiconductors, in terms of ICT technologies, so on and so forth. So there's a limit that Chinese companies can do to help the Russian economy, because we are not the top-notch tech companies in the world yet. No, what we are very good at, what China is very good at, is actually at the middle level and the lower to mid-level, maybe electronics and other manufactured products and goods. And maybe the Russian economy doesn't need as much as we think it might need. So it's really, we're talking about a mismatch between the Russian economic needs and the Chinese supply here. Of course, we don't know the details, but I think this is maybe something experts are a little bit exaggerating right now, that China's economy can perfectly complement Russia's economy. I don't think so. So for all these reasons, right? If you put them together, I would really doubt that how much Chinese companies can benefit from Russia. Not to mention Russia's economic size compared to the U.S. market plus the whole EU market. It's not even comparable. So why should I go to Russia when I have opportunities to enter the U.S. market or the Southeast Asian market, India market to a lesser degree, and the European markets, right? So when you're done with all these calculations, I think your answer probably is that a very limited number of companies in a very limited number of sectors would actually consider going into Russia market. Whether they can succeed or not, again, it's another big unknown right now. So I think again, mostly because Russia's economy is too small in a way, to meet the Chinese companies' appetite.
Yes, thank you, Ding Ding. Even before this whole crisis emerged, there was always a saying that China-Russia relations were hot politically and cold economically, and I think that's exactly because of the factors you just cited.
Let me give you another piece of statistics. Last year I think it was the China-Russia bilateral trade was at its highest in a number of years, but even that is only 150 billion US dollars. That's a very, very small number, and 80% of them is actually about energy products. So that means the two economic structures do not really complement each other.
And I think that also might be something that we're seeing in India. Biswaji, you mentioned earlier that the India-Russia relation is really strategic, not so much economic. So are Indian companies seeing opportunities here, or are there similar factors at play as with China, where they don't really see the Russian market as all that attractive?
No, I think it's almost the same, because India's exports to Russia last year was just about $3 billion. So it's really nothing to write home about, and the total trade between the two countries was less than $12 billion. So this is the point I was making, and if you factor in this fact that Indian companies have a very large interest in the West, especially in the US, and in the last couple of years, last year, I would say, India's exports to the US have gone up to record levels. And so if Indian companies have that kind of a market access in the US, it really makes no business sense for them to actually risk themselves. And we have the very good or bad example of continuing with our trade relations or economic relations with Iran, after the Western sanctions came in. And when India was forced to apply the sanctions, the Western sanctions, and walk the same path, then a lot of the Indian companies actually suffered. So I think these, and this is not too long in the past. So these memories of what really happened then would be fresh in the minds of all these companies. So although what Bruno was talking about, the companies taking their independent decisions, that really doesn't happen too much in India, because we don't have these big companies who are independent of the government in many different ways. So here in India, we have a very close, sort of almost a dependent relationship that the industry has vis-a-vis the government, and in many ways they're looking for largesse from the government. So it's not possible. It really doesn't happen that the Indian companies will step out and independently take a decision before the government does. That's not going to happen. But what is really going to happen, I think, is that given these facts that I just narrated on the economic front, and also whatever investments we have in the other countries, most of the investments are in the West, the Western countries, and the big IT firms are operating out of the US. So even if, for instance, opportunities come by their way in Russia, since a lot of these Western companies are withdrawing, I don't see how an Infosys or the companies owned by the Tatas, they would actually walk into Russia, and they take that much of risk. So I don't think that Indian companies will really be looking for opportunities. And again, the trade numbers that I mentioned, the increase has only been on the import side. On the export side, increase has been very little. There have been, some pharma companies who have been exporting more to Russia, but not at the scale of increase that we have seen in some of the on the import side. So I think on the India sort of reaching out to Russia in terms of investment, trade and investment, that situation is not going to arise in my view. So it's going to be our import dependence on Russia that is going to increase. But the Indian companies will always remain wary of engaging with Russia.
Thank you. I certainly learned a lot from all of your answers. I want to move now to our audience Q&A. We have a couple of questions from Andrew KP Leung. I'm going to start with this one. He asks, is Russia an energy insurance policy for China in light of US anti-China encirclement and containment? So Ding, obviously I'll start with you on this one, and then Bruno and Biswaji, you can feel free to chime in as well if you'd like.
Yeah, like I said, in the long run, if U.S.-China relationship gets into a very, very low level, right, then Russia's energy supply would certainly benefit China. And that's what I meant by strategic partnership or strategic benefit earlier. But unfortunately, that seems to be one of the very few big benefits that China can gain from Russia. But that again is dependent on how bad U.S.-China relationship can go, right? If U.S.-China relationship can maintain, I would say at the current level, then China's benefit from Russian energy supply will be still important, but not that big, because China's energy sources also come from other countries like the Middle East, Africa, and other countries. And don't forget, China is trying to actually move away from the fuel-based, energy consumption to a new energy consumption, which is, taking place very, very quickly. Just look at the number of, so-called new energy cars sales in China. It's the leading one in the world, accounting for about 50% of the new energy cars sold globally last year. So in 5 to maybe 8 years, China will move decisively into the new energy sector. So moving away from oil and gas, right? If that becomes a reality, then Russia's benefit as an energy supplier would further decrease. So I think that's another factor we should seriously consider. And also that also includes Europe, right? Europe is trying to become a new energy power by including investing in more, solar and wind and other types of energy. So I think the assumption again is the same, trying to move away from the traditional fuel-based energy consumption structure.
Bruno, or did you want to chime in on this?
Well, it's kind of interesting and paradoxical that on the one hand, the Ukraine war is giving a big push to the energy transition, because obviously people now realize that some of these energy supply sources are not reliable, and some regions like China and Europe that are always dependent on energy supplies from the outside can regard the energy transition as also as a form of energy independence. That's one element, but on the other hand, I think the immediate concern with energy security and the immediate concern with energy prices will, at least for the next 2 or 3 years, place a pause on the energy transition. That for the time being, decision makers are not willing to run too many risks, and they will be concerned with ensuring energy supplies from elsewhere. And that's what we've been seeing in terms of energy diplomacy in Algeria, in the Gulf, Qatar, and all the major players are traveling to these capitals and trying to ensure fossil fuel access for the time being for the next 2-3 years, because the situation is so critical and the political impact is so immediate. Russia, China, I think again, been trying to stress this note a bit. I do defer to Ding Ding, but I think there's some opportunities for China. Particularly, there will be new pipelines being built. I think some of them were on hold because the understanding was still that Russia would be essentially supplying Europe. After all, with the investment in Nord Stream 2, there wasn't room to invest in the new pipeline, the Altai pipeline, linking Russia and China through the east, not the power of Siberia, through the west, not the power of Siberia in the east. And I think the crisis in Europe-Russia relations will probably give a push to some of these projects. And again, China can benefit a little bit at least, because supply in this case doesn't depend on maritime sea routes that can be affected in a geopolitical crisis with the United States. That the border between Russia and China will be a privileged source, and that's what Andrew Leung asked about, a privileged source of energy access for China in case of a geopolitical confrontation over Taiwan. Now, I understand that openly Chinese decision makers will not be talking about this too much, but it is clearly an extra source of supply that will be important for China in the next 10 years. And then we enter the period that Ding Ding talked about of the energy transition, but I don't think it will be a discussion for the next 5 years at least.
Okay, that's actually a good transition into our next question from Noel Klehane. Now that China has seen how sanctions have been applied to Russia, will it seek to decouple even more from Western economies in order to better insulate itself against future sanctions on it for any action it might take on Taiwan or the South China Sea? So Ding Ding, if you don't mind, you're getting a lot of work in our Q&A section.
Sure. That's a very big question because actually China and Russia are very different in many aspects, including economic structures and the level of economic interdependence between China and the US and some Western countries. So the question, I think, is much more, I mean, the answer is much more complicated, right? Because US and European countries, I would think, can easily punish Russia economy, but when it comes to Chinese economy, it would be much more difficult, but of course, much more complicated. It can really hurt both sides very badly. So I think this is one of the major things that in the future, if something happens, for example, over Taiwan, that the US would need to think seriously, and the European countries would also, including Japan, would think very, very seriously. And also the second factor is whether China can sustain its own economic development without too much dependence or involvement or engagement with the Western market. Broadly speaking, a few years ago, China adopted this strategy or idea of two circulations, right? Whether it's internal circulation, economy, and the other is external circulation economy. And again, this year, China and the government is pushing very hard to create a unified domestic big market. You'll be surprised, China is already unified market given the strength of the central government. But in reality, it's actually quite fragmented because each province has its own style of industrial policies, favoring its own, local companies, entities, and so on and so forth. So you'll be surprised that we don't, have that kind of maybe EU level of internal market within China today. So that's again, the push by the government to create a more efficient, more integrated domestic market in case of great decoupling with other major economies. So I think that's another factor we need to take into account when China thinks about sanctions or other countries think about sanctions. And of course, sanctions, I don't think even in retrospect would stop Russia from attacking Ukraine, right? So let's go back to February or January. By the way, Russia has been under a sanction for already more than 80 years since they took Crimea in 2014. So it's not like, sanctions would have this strong deterrence effect. It didn't work for Russia, and I certainly don't think it would work for China if China is determined to do something, right, over Taiwan or elsewhere. So sanctions can only play a limited role. So I don't think it's really, the most important factor in both sides' calculation or strategies, but it is one important factor.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. It's hard to believe that we covered so much ground and yet still have so much to discuss, but we are at our hour. So thank you very much to our panelists for joining us. It was a fascinating discussion. And thank you to everyone in the audience. And we hope to see you at the next Diplomat webinar.